and welcome to this video. This is Tanveer Said, the Bengal Dragon. Make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons, as all your support really helps this legally blind YouTube content creator remain motivated to continue making a variety of videos on this channel, touching on several topics. The reason I'm making one more video about this, if you already noticed my previous few videos, is that especially with the last video, I realized that it wasn't structured well enough. So it went all over the place. And I felt that it deserves much better structure and much better quality. So as you can see, I have pulled out the better microphone. I have used the better software, although it's not that good at masking, but that's the best I can do. I also felt that I did not tell the full story the last time because I actually did a bit more research. And what I found out is that the tragic story of Claire Redfield is actually worse than I thought. It has gotten to a point where even I didn't think it was going to be this bad. So I felt that another final video was required to summarize and to basically completely explain the character arc of Claire Redfield, the original Claire Redfield, not the remake. I am going to talk about the character arc of Claire Redfield and not the gameplay. As someone who plays video games, I never found Resident Evil as impressive as Metal Gear Solid or God of War. So this is not going to be about the gameplay. Rather, this is going to be about the character arc. Finally, you might have noticed the strange nature of my previous video involving Batman. I had to do that when the original uploads were actually taken down due to copyright issues. So if you see something along those lines in this video as well, know that this video that you're watching right now is a re-upload. And finally, given the length of this video and the clips that you're about to see, I have put in a lot of hard work in this video. So I would deeply appreciate if you could like, subscribe, and even share this video with someone that you would think would find this content to be interesting. I will refer to the original video, however, because there are some points that will be repetitive, and I do not wish to go too much into detail about that. The link for the original video is in the description below, and I will provide timestamps on exactly which points I am referring to in the original video for your reference purposes. All right, I'm done with the wacky background that I had. The software I have, it doesn't do a good job of masking, especially when there's no background selected or a blank black screen selected. And no, I'm not going to re-record that part again because there's already a lot to record. I'm just going to use the background that I have basically of my bedroom. So basically no background. To start with, ignoring all the supplementary material such as comic books, such as director's notes and whatnot, and basically the justification of which is in the original video at around the 11-minute mark, because I have shown that there are several inconsistencies when it comes to those supplementary material. The in-game personality of the original Claire Redfield has been shown to be that of a person who is enormous hearted and who is very generous and who wants to help people, but not to the point where she's a doormat. She is not romantically involved with anyone and she doesn't want to date anyone. There is one exception to this rule, however, and who is also God conscious.
My God has protected you. It will always be with you.
Now, if you believe the director's version of the explanation on why she used the word God, that would not only explain that she is God conscious, but that would imply that she is religiously superstitious, because people who are not God conscious don't believe in such charms. Next, this might sound a bit repetitive, but just bear with me. She really wants to help people as long as you don't give her a reason to dislike you. Her default setting appears to be that she wants to help you. For other people, their default setting, generally to people they don't know that well, is indifference. But to Claire Redfield, she really wants to help people, and this has been shown throughout her appearances. For example, in Resident Evil 2, she gave Sherry the clothes off her back. In Resident Evil Code Veronica, she gave Rodrigo, who basically simply opened the cell door and sat down on his chair, because keeping her captive in an island that was attacked was completely pointless. She gave him the light in her hand and medicine to heal her wounds, and even offered to help him with the medication. Even in Resident Evil Degenerations, when the people hear a human type scream, Claire is the one who says that they have to help.
What was that?
Someone who isn't infected. We have to help.
And back to Code Veronica. Despite Steve giving her reason after reason not to like him, Claire almost forgives everything when she finds that Steve might be hurting inside or has some emotional pain.
You see? This thing is a lot more reliable than any person.
Than people? Steve, what were you doing here? Who brought you here, and where is your family?
Next, and this is something I missed the last time, she actually values keeping promises a lot. I have noticed that she uses that word quite a bit.
Don't worry, I'll protect you. I promise. Remember your promise. Chris, promise me. Please promise that you won't leave me alone again.
I am gonna come back. I promise.
I'll be back. I promise.
So for her, keeping promises is a very important thing. Now, this, along with the Steve factor that I mentioned, keep these in mind because these will become important soon enough later on in this video. This is something that I actually failed to mention in the previous video. In Code Veronica, there are actually two main stories being told: the foreground story and the background story. In the foreground, the story is mostly about the T Veronica virus. However, the foreground story is discredited when Wesker mentions this in the end.
Well done, Chris. It turns out that Alexia's work wasn't much of anything. So now the only thing left is revenge.
So to supplement this, all you need to know from the foreground story is that Wesker is alive, and Chris and Wesker will face off in another game where you actually have control over Chris. This is further compounded by the fact that the events of Rockford Island or Antarctica or Code Veronica in general is barely ever mentioned in a canonical Resident Evil game. Darkside Chronicles not counting. In other Resident Evil games, I barely came across any significant mention of the events of Code Veronica. But to understand the background story a bit better, pay attention to these cutscenes and how Claire might perceive it from her perspective.
I was a prisoner on this island. And I'm guessing you're not from Umbrella either.
No, I'm Claire. Claire Redfield.
Claire? Nice. I'll remember that. Hey, I heard there's an airport around here. Well, once I find it, I can finally escape from this crazy island. Well, I'll see ya.
Hey, wait up!
I don't want you following me, lady. You'll only slow me down. Well, that file shows the latitude and longitude of this place. Why don't you send your brother the coordinates and ask him to come help?
Thanks. I'll do that.
Hey, I was just kidding. There's no way he could get here, even if he is your brother.
Yes, he can. I'm sure of it.
No way. He won't come. You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
What was that all about?
See you around, Claire. Adios.
Hey, wait! Steve!
Don't worry, Claire. Your knight in shining armor is here.
I actually thought about this one because for the longest time, this specific cutscene stood out to me. Now I realize that this was not Steve flirting with Claire. No, this is worse. This is Steve insulting Claire. This is Steve saying that Claire is some type of soft, dainty princess who needs a knight in shining armor to protect her because she's too weak to protect herself. And the response that is elicited by this condescending is,
You wish.
But thanks for the help.
See? This is why you need me. I got your back.
Whatever. Here, take these.
Machine guns? For me?
You know the deal, in exchange for your Lugers.
Okay. This thing is too cool. Yes! Now this is my kind of weapon. All right! Huh? Hey, this thing's empty. You cheated me.
Up there, plenty of ammo, just for you.
Way up there?
Give me a boost and I'll get it for you. You still have plenty of ammo. You don't have to worry about holding back. Do you want me to take care of this for you, little boy?
You see? This thing is a lot more reliable than any person.
Than people? Steve, what were you doing here? Who brought you here and where is your family?
Shut up! I don't want to talk about it!
Steve.
Never mind. Let's get going.
It's okay now. Just rest. Wait!
What's going on?
Steve! A secret door!
After her!
Are you okay?
I'm fine. It's just a scratch.
It's finally over!
Claire, I'm sorry. I know I caused a lot of trouble for you.
No, it's okay. It was hard for both of us.
Well, I really hope you find your brother. I know what it's like to be alone.
Oh, Steve.
this, the most cringe-worthy scene in the entire game, deservedly so. Remember, Claire does not perceive this. So from Claire's perspective, this doesn't count.
It's all my fault.
Don't say that. Listen to me. We'll escape from here. Together. Come on. We've got to shut off the gas. If we split up, we'll have a better chance of stopping it.
Okay.
Steve! Don't forget, we'll get out of here. Together.
Ah! Ah!
Steve! Hold on. I'll waste that monster and come back.
Claire, forget about me. Run! I'm sorry. I failed you.
Don't worry about it. Let's go.
The background story, however, is that of the mental devastation of Claire Redfield. Let me illustrate this a bit further. Notice how she begins the game. And this is something I should have highlighted further in my previous episode. Notice her expressions from the time she realizes that Steve is a monster until the end of the game. That is not an expression of fear. She genuinely looks like she's about to cry. Think about that. A monster is hacking away at some bars, trying to kill her. And instead of running away or running to the other side of the room or trying the door again, she is looking at him about to cry? Steve meant that much to her? This also tells you that part of her maybe believed that Steve is actually gone and replaced by this monster.
Chris, there should be a self-destruct system somewhere. If you activate it, all the electronic locks might be deactivated. You've made it!
Of course.
Notice that even after giving Chris specific instructions to set off the self-destruct sequence, Claire acts surprised at Chris's success. Keep this in mind because this will become very important later on in the video. Also, this is something I missed in the previous episode, and this further shows that Claire's story has been moved to the background almost literally.
I'll keep her busy.
Did you catch that? Here it is again. Notice where her left hand is.
I'll keep her busy. Just go for the emergency elevator.
Chris!
She is basically clutching at her chest with an expression of fear in her face. She never acted this frightened up until this point in the entire series. Even in Resident Evil 2, when Claire had no idea what a zombie is, or even when she faced the liquor for the first time, she never acted this frightened. This means that for a girl that started the game with so much fire, adrenaline, and determination, something so severe happened that it almost knocked the fight out of her. Also, and this is something I should have emphasized even more in the previous video, notice this line.
Vader,
Chris, but...
I can take care of this. Just go.
You have to make it. Don't die on me.
Not only is there a tone change between Chris, but and the rest of what she says, where she says Chris, but in a tone of concern, and the rest in a tone that is almost scolding Chris. This is a very loaded line. Chris, who cares about Claire, and in return, Claire cares about Chris, is trying to protect her. The last time someone who cared about Claire, and who in return Claire cared about, tried to protect her, didn't make it and died on her. So this is Claire basically telling Chris what happened to Steve, saying that Steve didn't make it and died on me. Don't you die on me too.
You have to make it. Don't die on me.
And also, Think about this line. This is a line you have heard in other scenarios, usually between a man and a woman who are of romantic interest. You've heard this even in Resident Evil. I believe Leon said it to Ada. Ada said a variation of it to Leon. Even Eva from Metal Gear 3 said a variation of this to Naked Snake, or who was Big Boss later on. Claire is telling this to her brother? This suddenly makes the context of this very depressing. And to add to this, from this final battle point, Claire constantly seeks assurances from Chris about making it.
You have to make it. Don't die on me.
Remember your promise.
Chris, promise me. Please promise that you won't leave me alone again.
It's almost as if she is begging for Chris to succeed and to make it out alive and to not leave her again. Think about that. For a girl that had so much fire and even sass,
I have no idea what you're babbling about.
You don't fool me! I am Alfred Ashford, commander of this base.
Oh? You must be one of Umbrella's lower level officers if you're in command of a backwater base like this one.
to be turned into someone who is this desperate, it shows that something that severe happened to Claire. And finally, notice her confidence in her brother's abilities.
Why don't you send your brother the coordinates and ask him to come help?
Thanks, I'll do that.
Hey, I was just kidding. There's no way he could get here, even if he is your brother.
Yes, he can, I'm sure of it.
And also, in this moment where Claire raises Steve's hand, and yes, it's not the other way around. Claire's hand is in the bottom. I don't know why people think that Steve is actually bringing her hand to his face. He has to take a breath between the words your and warm. So he's not in a condition to do anything. Notice, even here, she is confident in her brother's abilities.
You're warm.
Steve, you've got to hang in there, okay? My brother's come to save us. We're getting out of here.
That her brother will come and save them and they will get out of there together. Now, after Steve's death, notice her reactions to her brother.
You've made it!
Of course.
Now do you understand? She acted surprised because something so severe happened that not only the confidence in her abilities was almost broken, her confidence even in her brother's abilities was severely shaken. Take a look at these other clips if you don't believe me. Because the rest of the game, she goes, Chris, please make it. Chris, please make it. Chris, please make it. Chris, don't leave me. This further shows that Steve's death not only shattered her confidence in her own abilities, but even shook her confidence in her brother's abilities. She was that badly wounded by what happened to Steve. And believe me, it gets worse. And this is why I needed to make another video to fully explain the extent of her mental devastation. Speaking of Steve, a person that, let me remind everyone, even Claire knew only for one day. Because it's not like only Steve knew Claire for one day, it's the other way around as well. My analysis concludes that Claire never got over how Steve died. This is because I have seen that in future biohazard incidents that she was involved in directly, and by that I mean only 2 appearances. Resident Evil Degenerations, because it is very consistent with the timeline, and Resident Evil Revelations 2, which is canonically the last time Claire Redfield shows up. In these 2 biohazard incidents that followed, there are explicit and subtle signs that indicate that Claire's mind goes back to the events of Code Veronica much more than the events of Raccoon City. Let us begin with this game. For a girl to have the fight knocked out of her after Steve's death, whereas she was nothing but fighting at the beginning of the game, notice the one time after Steve's death, she gets some fight back.
I have Steve to work with.
What?
Steve.
In his body, there's still a living T. Alexia virus. Steve should be a good specimen. Maybe he'll come back alive just as I did and be able to see your sister again.
You freak.
Don't you touch him!
That's right. The one time she even gets a little bit of fight back is when Steve is mentioned and when Wesker implies that he is going to do horrible things to Steve's corpse. This goes to show you how badly Claire was hurt by Steve's death, and also goes to show you that underneath all that bravado and all that energy, Claire Redfield is a softie. And even unbeknownst to Chris, he puts Claire in the same position again. Once again, Chris is trying to protect Claire from Wesker the monster. And that is why this supposedly cheesy Bollywood interaction.
You get out of here, Claire.
But what about...
As a surviving member of STARS, I have to finish this.
Okay. Remember your promise.
No, I'm not going to make fun of that. Not in this video. If you want me to make fun of that, I will do that in another video. Just put it in the comment section below. But this interaction suddenly has a lot more weight because Claire is constantly reminding Chris, don't you die on me too. And this is actually some pretty heavy storytelling. I am so surprised that I did not find even a single YouTube video that actually puts this front and center. I'm surprised that no one highlighted this. To add to this heavy storytelling, let's move on to the final cutscene, which is filled with signs of Claire's mental devastation. I established earlier that the most likely thing Claire is doing is that she is crying and praying at the same time. You can refer back to the original video around the 41-minute and 14-second mark.
Chris, where are you?
Once Chris lands on the Harrier, this is the foreground story.
Chris!
Hey, you know that I always keep my promises.
Claire is chuckling at a cheesy joke. Now, this is the background story.
Hey, you know that I always keep my promises.
Your brother kept his promise. I'm sorry, I cannot.
Hey, you know that I always keep my promises.
The background story is that Claire's brain is telling her that she should be happy. She is escaping with Chris, a person she tried to find for 3 months. But she is so depressed and so devastated inside that she has to force out a chuckle, force out some type of a smile. And that is the best she can do. This is further compounded by the fact that in the game itself, we have seen her being much happier.
Huh? Hey, this thing's empty. You cheated me.
I hear Hawaii's nice this time of year.
You got it.
We did it! We're finally out!
And in all of those instances, she was without Chris. And the one time when she's finally with Chris, escaping with him, she gives a chuckle as if she's holding herself from melting into tears. It is almost as if part of her brain reverted to that of a child. That is very depressing. And finally, in the Harrier, this is something I failed to emphasize in the last video. First, notice how slowly Claire brings her slightly trembling left hand to the back of Chris's seat, indicating that she is just torn up about all the events that happened moments ago.
Chris, promise me. Please promise that you won't leave me alone again.
Once again, she is requesting Chris to promise her something. And given that how important keeping promises are to her, as I've established earlier in this video, that is also part of some heavy storytelling. Now, look at Chris's response, and more importantly, look at Chris's facial expression and Claire's facial expression.
I'm sorry, Claire, but it's not over yet. There's still something we've got to do.
Chris looks like he is determined, focused, and on a mission. At the same time, Claire looks like she's about to burst into tears. If the big frown on her face didn't make it that obvious, she looks drained, exhausted, and the best word I can use is defeated. She doesn't want to do this anymore. Just try and understand the context of this, okay? In Resident Evil 2, she ends the game with a smile.
Claire. Sherry.
She has smiled before on the verge of escaping. Here's another clip that I didn't use in this video. Even at the end of Resident Evil Degenerations, she cracks a joke, but whatever, overall positive vibes while ending Resident Evil Degenerations.
I have a limousine waiting.
No, I'm not going to make fun of that. That is for the Bolly Critic, aka Blind Man Reviews, to do. Even in Resident Evil Revelations 2, on her way to the Burton residence, she smiled at herself. But the one time where she should be over the moon because she tried to find her brother across the seas for over 3 months and finally found him, escaping with him, she's about to burst into tears. So the foreground story is that Chris is basically going after Umbrella, basically indicating the formation of BSAA, an organization, let me remind people, only Claire Redfield from the original protagonist doesn't join, who is not tied down to Stratcom. Only Claire Redfield doesn't join. Okay, even Rebecca Chambers joins BSAA. So that's the foreground story. The background story is that Claire is escaping with her brother, but something so severe happened that in what is most likely the happiest day of her life, she's about to explode into tears. This is some very heavy storytelling that people don't highlight. Her facial expression reads that she doesn't want to do this anymore. She is too mentally wounded to be actively involved in another biohazard incident of her own volition again. And this is all over a guy that she knew only for one day. This is the scene, in case that one person doesn't know what I'm talking about. This is the scene that I'm referring to.
Oh, Steve.
You're warm.
Steve, you've got to hang in there, okay? My brother's come to save us. We're getting out of here.
Your brother kept his promise. I'm sorry, I cannot.
What? What are you saying?
I'm glad that I I love you. Claire.
Steve? Steve?
Steve!
This one incident changed her life pretty much entirely in the Resident Evil franchise canonically. Because the main plot regarding the T Veronica virus, how did Wesker put it again?
It turns out that Alexia's work wasn't much of anything.
So the point of Code Veronica was to actually bring Claire Redfield to her mental breaking point. And this is the beauty of Code Veronica that people did not figure out. They told the female protagonist story in reverse. Because think about it. What normally happens with a female protagonist? They start the game weak and end the game relatively stronger, like you saw with Final Fantasy X. Or they start the game strong and end the game strong as well, like you see with Tomb Raider. But in Code Veronica, Claire Redfield started the game very strong, basically surviving an umbrella facility and basically fighting all the guards, and ends the game about to dissolve into tears. She starts the game strong and ends the game very weak. I have not seen another game that does this with a female protagonist. I have seen a male protagonist where they start the game weak and end the game weak as well. And this is the game that a lot of people crap on, but the game was there for storytelling purposes, not for gameplay purposes. It's God of War Ascension, where Kratos starts the game very much mentally down, and after killing Orcos, Kratos ends the game also very much mentally down and finds his only salvation, his only hope, if you will, is by his servitude to the gods. But in terms of a female protagonist, I have not seen another game that starts the female protagonist to be very strong and ends the female protagonist in that game as very weak. And this is why I don't like Darkside Chronicles and their version of the events of Code Veronica. Darkside Chronicles, it turned Claire Redfield into a random teenager. The depth of the original Code Veronica that was given to Claire Redfield, which I had to dig, and a lot of other people had to dig, but there's barely any highlight of it, at least on YouTube. That depth is missing. That tragedy is missing. They just turned her into a random teenager. And this is why I also don't have faith in the Resident Evil Code Veronica fan remake. From the clips that I have seen, they are going to repeat the same storytelling mistakes as the original Code Veronica, because I don't think even they realized what Code Veronica was actually trying to do. And they're going to repeat the same nonsense. They are not going to focus on Claire Redfield's character story. They're going to focus more around the T Veronica virus and Steve and Chris and Wesker and all this thing. Whereas the main purpose of Code Veronica was to tell Claire's story. Do you remember when Code Veronica came out? I heard that there were special red colored Dreamcasts to promote Code Veronica. For Chris? For Wesker? No, it's for Claire. And another complaint I have is that they have all the resources, they have the technology, they have the software, but they can't scrounge up some money to actually hire voice actors, to hire some decent voice actors. It doesn't have to be Alyson Court, it doesn't have to be Bill Houston, but they don't have some money to add more dialogues and have them recorded and put that into the game instead of taking snippets from here and there all the time. Good Lord. It doesn't seem like a fan remake. It seems like a weekend project, an extended weekend project. But getting back to the trauma, my analysis concludes that this trauma never went away. There are several signs of this, and one of them is going to be repetitious. But bear with me. One, Claire Redfield is the only one that did not join BSAA who is not tied down to Stratcom. Even Rebecca Chambers, who was the designated healer of Alpha Team in Resident Evil 1, she ended up joining BSAA. And she had some degree in chemistry or something. She ended up joining BSAA. Sherry, it is indicated that even Sherry at the end might have ended up joining BSAA if an ink ribbon video is supposed to be believed. Now, moving to degenerations. This is the weakest reference to the events of Code Veronica. Pay very close attention to the tone of Claire Redfield saying these two lines.
We just ended up making things worse.
You chose the role of rescuer rather than fighter like me. You chose a path that your brother and I couldn't follow. You weren't wrong.
Leon, thank you.
Now, it should be the other way around, but the reference to Code Veronica is in that detail. Notice, Leon refers to Claire as rescuer. Now, for Claire, that is a heavy word. What happened the last time she tried to rescue someone?
Steve? No, I can't do it.
Claire! Help me! Claire!
I love you, Claire.
He died confessing his love for Claire, and she failed. And that is why it sounded like Claire was starting to cry whilst thanking Leon, who, by the way, is standing on the opposite end of the screen. And people thought they're in a relationship. However, this line from Leon makes no sense.
You chose the role of rescuer rather than fighter like me. You chose a path that your brother and I couldn't follow.
Leon rescued Ashley in Resident Evil 4. Leon rescued civilians in this movie. Leon rescued people in Resident Evil 6. Okay, in a way, Leon rescued people in Resident Evil 2 as well. Chris rescued people, I believe even in the first Resident Evil, rescued Jill, if you play as Chris, rescued Claire in Code Veronica, rescued people in Resident Evil 5, rescued people in Resident Evil 6, rescued Ethan Winters or something in Resident Evil 7, rescued people in Resident Evil 8, I think. Both of them rescue people all the time. What is Leon talking about? But this also tells me that Leon might have known of Steve, but doesn't know what happened to Steve and what Steve meant to Claire. Another sign of this trauma is in the very opening exchange between Claire and Ronnie's aunt and Ronnie. The latter two, by the way, not played by an Indian, but don't tell the Bolly critic about it.
It's been ages. You look great.
You look tired.
Blame my new boyfriend. He won't let me get any sleep.
Boyfriend, huh? Is that what you're calling the WHO report now?
FDA, actually.
That is very, very depressing, considering the fact that this is 7 years after the events of Code Veronica. She made that statement implying that her TerraSave work assignments are her boyfriends that keep her up at night. Anyone who has seen people go through severe depression, especially concerning losing someone that they value a lot, will tell you that as a compensation mechanism, they will throw themselves in their work or in other tasks to the point where all they think about is their work and their assignments and whatnot, and their projects and whatnot. Their work becomes their life, their work becomes their hobby, their work becomes their relationships. And I have actually seen this myself involving two people who romantically liked each other. But in my example, it's the girl that died, not the guy. And I have seen the guy go through this throwing themselves in the work. And eventually they grew in their position. Just like with Claire Redfield, she appears to be someone important in TerraSave, grew into that position. And all of this triggered by a compensation mechanism as a reaction to how Steve died. That's why I titled this part, It All Goes Back to Steve. This screams that in the immediate aftermath of Code Veronica, she was close, this close to being broken. Another indication in Degenerations is her change in attitude. It seems that from this point, biohazard incidents tend to trigger something painful within her to the point where she doesn't even like people joking about it.
What the hell is this?
Ronnie, wait here, okay?
Did someone put you up to this? Or is this stupid costume your brilliant idea, huh? Okay, genius. You got something to say? Get it off your chest and move on!
This is too much.
But what is more telling is her reaction when she truly finds herself in another biohazard incident. And keep in mind, this is after 7 years of the events of Code Veronica. Now, ignoring the fact that Capcom somehow found a way to make Claire Redfield look ugly, where I think her face looks like a potato, pay very close attention to her reaction. Did you see what's different? Let me show you again.
Look, I'm sorry I bothered you, okay? Just don't come any closer. Are you listening?
Still having trouble? Allow me to explain. This reaction is fear-induced. This reaction is also fear-induced. But this reaction is a psychological trigger born from mental trauma. That's right. Claire Redfield in Code Veronica was not traumatized by the events of Raccoon City that she went through 3 months prior to Code Veronica. But Claire Redfield was traumatized severely by the events of Code Veronica that she went through 7 years before Degenerations. The trauma born from Code Veronica was that severe. The trigger was that severe. In fact, if you watch this movie, she starts by frantically asking the security guard to get away from a zombie, then tries to search for Ronnie whilst everyone else is running in the other direction. But when she gets to this point, she barely even takes one step back. In fact, she might be walking towards the zombies and she's acting as if she's in denial. It's as if her nightmares took form and substance. It's as if she is living her nightmares again with this traumatic expression.
This can't be happening.
She is that traumatized. She's not even trying to escape or even looking for Ronnie. The trauma that was triggered almost froze her in place, as if she's in denial of her nightmares coming to life. This suggests that Claire Redfield didn't get over what happened to Steve. She suppressed it. This is the reaction of someone who suppresses trauma. Why else would she act this traumatized 7 years after the events of Code Veronica? Think about that. She knows about the events that happened in Dead Aim. She probably knows about the events that happened in Resident Evil 4. She works for TerraSave, an organization that is focused on providing victim support to the victims of biohazard incidents. Okay, she's like the external support, the supplementary support to the BSAA. Okay, and if nothing else, she knows about the biohazard incidents and the bio research relating to biohazards that's happening in India in this very movie. So it's not like she's detached from biohazards completely, but she gives this type of traumatized deer in headlights reaction after finding that she is in a biohazard incident right now, after 7 years surviving her last biohazard incident. She is that traumatized still. And by the way, if you're wondering about the change in shirt color, I'm recording this over a couple of days, all right? More than a couple of days. I'm recording this over multiple days. So yeah, stuff happens. That shirt's in the wash right now. And no, this has nothing to do with the Resident Evil content or Redfield, my shirt color being red. In fact, if you've been following my channel, I am astronomically more a fan of Batman and God of War. In fact, this is the back of my phone. It's a Batman sticker. And finally, what I feel is one of the most subtle yet very strong indication of her trauma is this part where Claire Redfield slaps the senator. Just pay very close attention to what Claire says.
I can't stand kids. They're a real pain in the ass.
Bastard! That little girl will probably have nightmares for the rest of her life because of you.
Now, on the surface, it seems rather harmless and benign, and it might be referring to Sherry. And even I thought along those lines as well, until I saw the gameplay of Resident Evil Survivor 2. What was the context of Resident Evil Survivor 2 again? It is Claire's nightmare on her flight away from the exploding Antarctica base. And what is her nightmare about? It's not about surviving with Chris. It's not about surviving with Leon. It's not about surviving with Sherry. It's not even about Raccoon City. It's a mishmash about places on Rockford Island and the Antarctica base. And it is about her surviving with Steve. So all of a sudden, Claire Redfield saying,
Nightmares, 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 nightmares for the rest of her life.
This all of a sudden has a lot more weight. This is Claire basically telling the senator that Ronnie will probably have recurring nightmares for the rest of her life, just like Claire. Because who'd know about these nightmares better than Claire? And also, if you've noticed in this movie and in Revelations 2, it seems whenever she is in another biohazard or biohazard type incident and this painful memory gets triggered, Claire gets angrier and angrier. And this is also a psychological reaction to trauma. All signs point to whatever happened in terms of her character change that you are seeing after Code Veronica, it all goes back to what happened to Steve. She seems to get angrier and angrier, especially at who she perceives is responsible for the biohazard incident. And speaking of nightmares, this is actually something I found out after I thought there is nothing else to find out. In the most unlikely place. This is from Resident Evil Survivor 2. And by the way, the clip I'm about to use, shout out to the gamer Shankster who actually allowed me to use this small clip from his video. Okay, in Resident Evil Survivor 2, there is a file called Secret Report Number 5, Claire's monologue. It is basically Claire's thoughts while she was having this dream. Firstly, if you've actually accessed this file in the actual game, the music that they're playing here is the exact same music that they were playing in the original Code Veronica when Chris finds Claire crying her eyes out behind a locked door over Steve.
Is that you, Claire?
Chris?
No! The door won't open. Hey, is Steve with you?
Steve, he...
Okay, now here is the report. Just pay close attention to it. That is very, very depressing. She was basically showing the signs of starting to go mad, as in insane with grief, where she couldn't even tell reality from her dream or her nightmare. That is very, very depressing. That the death of a guy that, need I remind people, even she knew for only one day, and the way he died hit her that hard that she was starting to hallucinate. It seemed that she was going into some type of a happy place to actually retreat from the bad memories and the painful emotion. Another thing that you see a lot of people going through depression do. For me, the most telling parts were when Claire implies in her monologue that it could have manifested in the worst way. Her farewell to Steve could have been a reality, but there's nothing to fear. They want the future. They're escaping. Dolphins jumping around and all that. It's time to put the fear behind. It's time to talk to Steve. But Steve wouldn't turn around. And then Claire wakes up, her face covered in sweat and her own tears. Perhaps that was part of her brain telling her that the reason Steve was not turning around and not responding is because dead people don't respond. The very thought that her farewell to Steve could have been a reality even slid in her thoughts, and she basically retreated from that, choosing to believe the dream over what actually happened, choosing to believe an alternate reality in her head. Maybe that's the way of part of her mind telling her that the reality is that you are escaping, but Steve gave his life so that you could escape. Steve is not escaping with you because Steve is dead. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is one of her nightmares. And How did Claire put it about having nightmares in degenerations?
Nightmares for the rest of her life.
Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, I was shocked when I read that monologue and when I found out that basically the game is implying that Claire was so devastated that Steve's death probably hurt Claire more than it hurt Steve over a guy she knew for one day. And the gamer Chancellor was actually confused because he didn't see any mention of Chris or Sherry or Leon. My friend, it is by design. It is not an oversight. Let me remind people how her facial expression was when she was escaping with Chris, a person, her family member that she was trying to find for over 3 months. She was about to explode into tears. Now do you see why she was about to explode into tears? And this also further underscores the fact that she is the only biohazard survivor who is a protagonist from the original Resident Evil series of games who did not join BSAA. Not because of whatever stupid reason Leon provided in this movie. It is because she is so traumatized by the events of Code Veronica, she still hasn't gotten over it. She is still suppressing it. And that trauma would not let her join the BSAA and actively engage in biohazard incidents of her own volition again. This is some very heavy storytelling that even till now, as of this recording, May 7, 2022, I still did not find YouTube videos that highlight this tragedy, this trauma. And finally, moving to Resident Evil Revelations 2. She finds herself in yet another biohazard style incident. What is the first thing she does after acquiring a gun and responding to Moira's question?
Are you gonna use that? It's more reliable than any person.
More reliable than any person.
She quotes Steve verbatim, word per word, after 13 years after Code Veronica. She quotes Steve word per word on guns. This tells you that she is still suppressing what happened to Steve. She still didn't get over it. And believe me, there is one more piece of evidence that I found in this game that is extremely telling of the fact that she did not get over what happened to Steve even after 13 years down the line. But this implies that after Code Veronica, if anything, the fans maybe believe that Claire walked it off, what happened to Steve and the events in maybe like 15 minutes or whatnot. Like she just dusted it off her shoulders. No. The most likely scenario is that immediately after escaping Antarctica and things starting to settle down, becoming more normal, Claire Redfield probably went into therapy. Because if she's acting this traumatized, this hurt, even after 13 years, that she's still carrying the scars and carrying the wounds of Code Veronica, she probably went into therapy right after the events of Code Veronica. And that would explain even more why psychologically she can't join BSAA, even though she has the skills in terms of weapons. She just can't mentally bring herself to joining BSAA. And finally, this specific part is my way of saying thank you to a fellow YouTuber, Raccoon City Cinema, who recently just achieved 2,000 subscribers. So congratulations. And this whole part, including the small music video snippet that will be included at the end of this point, is my way of saying thank you to you. Continuing with Resident Evil 2 Revelations. This is the most telling part about Claire having memories of Steve in terms of expression. Notice her reaction once Neil starts to transform into a monster after pushing her away. And just as a note, Neil is the guy that Claire specifically mentions is not her boyfriend. And this is when Claire is 32 years old. So she is way past the point of being shy about these things.
Get away from me! There's no bringing the FBC back. I failed Lancel. Ouroboros, it's not death. It's
Oh, she was here before. She has that traumatized deer in headlights look again. She was here before 13 years ago. The only difference is 13 years ago, the person she valued, when he turned into a monster, he kept himself from taking Claire's head off and ended up saving her life because he loved her. This time, a person she values is turning into a monster specifically to kill her after betraying her. Steve would never betray her, even in his monster form. And what is Claire's reaction? She's seen cringing in emotional pain and about to cry because her mind went back to that trauma, that pain, that event that she is still suppressing. She still hasn't gotten over it 13 years down the line. So in Revelations 2, when Neil is turning into a monster, trying to kill her after betraying all that she has worked for with TerraSave, most of which was probably triggered by what happened to Steve. Claire is cringing in emotional pain, about to cry. And this is why the trigger here is so strong. That Claire wants to kill Neil with her own hands. Even when Claire found Neil and Neil tried to justify what he did.
Neil? Neil!
I did what I thought was right.
It wasn't.
When Neil is basically trying to reach out for a compassionate hand of a friend or something, Claire is almost like, how dare you? And tries to kill him there as well by stepping on his throat, but eventually lets go, leaving Neil to suffer to death or something. But once the memory of Steve was triggered in such a similar way, Claire was so angry that she wanted to kill him herself. I don't recall Claire being this angry. Claire is one of the nicest human beings that you can find. She'll probably give you one of her arms as long as she doesn't dislike you, if she thinks that's going to help you out. That's how she started the series. Going from that to the point where Claire wants to kill someone with her own hands after being betrayed like this. This goes to show that the pivotal moment in her life was the death of Steve. So, to put all of this together, Claire not joining the BSAA, Claire acting so traumatized, and her mind going back to what happened to Steve, the 2 times she showed up in another biohazard incident after Code Veronica, other movies not counting. Claire implying that even in her personal life, her only relationships or boyfriends are her TerraSave work assignments, also specifying that Neil is not her boyfriend. So probably Neil was like a leader figure that Claire was pretty much inspired by. Putting all of this together, that is extremely depressing to see that Claire still hasn't gotten over what happened in Code Veronica and specifically what happened to Steve and how he died. How did that Linkin Park song go again?
I did what I thought was right.
It wasn't.
Get away from me!
And this is why I have been focusing on the Claire Redfield character arc so much. Because from the original protagonist, it seems that Claire Redfield is the only one with this amount of potential, depth, and potential. No one else from the original protagonist has this level of depth. And as I demonstrated, much of it goes back to Steve. Now, why it goes back to Steve, that is Capcom's problem. Because they already established that Claire Redfield, her story is not one of triumph as much as it is one of tragedy. So when people say Claire's a badass and whatnot, no. Now when I see Claire, I see a tragedy survivor, a survivor who has a tragic story to tell. Capcom furthered the tragedy in Code Veronica, which, let me remind you, gameplay wise, I did not find fascinating at all. I found it to be a step backwards from Resident Evil 3. But I bought Code Veronica 3 times between 2001 and 2005 because subliminally there was something about this game that stood out. And about 20 years down the line, I finally figured it is Claire Redfield's reverse female protagonist story. Code Veronica established the tragedy, but Capcom, although they furthered the extent of the tragedy by that monologue in Resident Evil Survivor 2, they failed to capitalize on this. All right, to begin with, let me start with my problems with Resident Evil Revelations 2, especially the Claire Redfield story. Not the gameplay, because the gameplay, it just ripped it off from The Last of Us. And The Last of Us took elements of its gameplay from games like Splinter Cell Conviction, another game that I really, really enjoyed playing and is my favorite Splinter Cell game in the entire series, maybe just slightly ahead of Chaos Theory. This is because Splinter Cell Convictions actually focuses a bit more on the story of Sam Fisher than they do on the fall of Third Echelon. The series has used 4 games to build up Sam Fisher and his camaraderie with members of Third Echelon, such as with members like Irving Lambert and Anna Grimsdottir. Splinter Cell Convictions is basically a bit more of a retribution type of story from Sam Fisher's perspective, which I really, really liked. And the whole plot about taking over Third Echelon, that was intertwined very well with Sam Fisher's story. And no, I did not like Blacklist because they had such a good starting. They had such a good opening and build up that there is an organization that is actually getting the better of Fourth Echelon. But they ended up giving it an all-American, very cliche type of ending, which I felt ruined the rest of the game. Anyways, getting back to Revelations 2. My problem is that this game came out during the period of the Super Retcon. And the period of the Super Retcon, I believe, started, at least from what I perceive, from Dark Side Chronicles. That's when they started retelling some of the stories and making personality and character changes. Like Leon was always grumpy and moody. If you compare him to the Paul Haddad Leon, the Paul Haddad Leon has a lot more optimism and is not that sarcastic. The Paul Mercier Leon works good in Resident Evil 4 onwards. He doesn't work well in Resident Evil 2. But in Revelations 2, some of the examples of this super retcon is, for one, it seems Claire forgot how to take care of children. There is a child that you have to escort, I believe, from time to time. Her name is Natalie or Natalia or something. Claire took care of a child in Resident Evil 2, took care of a child in Resident Evil Degenerations. So it is established that she knows how to work with children. But in Revelations 2, it's like she forgot how to take care of children. And also, another part is when a document reveals that apparently the Redfields are orphans. Now, this detail I did not see in any other Resident Evil before Revelations 2, especially before the Super Retcon period. I did not see it in 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica 4, or 5. If I missed it, please do let me know in the comment section below where in the game itself does it mention that the Redfields are orphans. Because this type of detail, it even confused people like the critic Drinker when he was watching Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Even he indicated that the Redfields are not orphans. And Capcom used this plot that Claire is an orphan to justify why she's close to Moira. Moira is not an orphan. Both of Moira's parents are alive. Estranged and separated, but alive. And believe me, there is a big difference between estranged or separated parents and no parents. Believe me, I have seen both type of people who have estranged parents and people who have no parents or are orphans. There is a very big difference. And that inconsistency is why I have been avoiding talking about Revelations 2. Revelations 2 should have been only about Moira and Barry Burton. Claire should not have been even in the picture. If you're thinking that I'm considering Code Veronica to be a flawless game, please stop being delusional. Code Veronica is one of the most poorly executed games in the entire Resident Evil franchise. The only two things that they got right to a certain degree, not without its flaws, but still they got relatively much right. One, Alyson Court's voice acting, which I will have to say, considering the work I have seen of Alyson Court, I will get to this in a little bit as well in this video. This is perhaps her best voice acting. And two, the Claire Redfield reverse female protagonist story. But Capcom were stupid enough to put such a powerful character element in the background and put some stupid nonsense about the Veronica virus in the foreground, which would never be relevant in the rest of the series again.
It turns out that Alexia's work wasn't much of anything.
And just to show you Capcom's failure of execution, take this concept, just this simple concept. A protagonist, regardless of male or female or whatever, a protagonist starting the game very strong and ending the game very weak mentally. Take that concept and give it to Sony Santa Monica Studios. Where have you seen that? That's right, the original God of War. Granted that Kratos' tragedy is astronomically more than anything ever conceived in any Resident Evil game. The basic arc of starting strong and ending weak is there in the original God of War, where Kratos, a former captain of the Spartan army, renowned to fight till the last drop of blood and the last breath, a champion of the gods, was driven to commit suicide. And if you must know, my original plan for this video was actually to talk about Kratos, because there is a lot that I thought people missed about the Kratos character arc from the original God of War games. But there is another YouTuber who actually did this video titled something along the lines of the one thing everyone gets wrong about Kratos. So he did an amazing job with that, exploring his depth of character and personality and exploring his tragedy a lot more, intertwined with the politics of the gods and the betrayal of the gods. I don't think I would have added anything significant. So that's why I did not do the Kratos video, even though God of War is my favorite game series of all time. And getting to Resident Evil 2 Remake, Capcom showed the entire world that they are not good at storytelling. A Capcom game will seldom have very good storytelling. Capcom is Capcom. Capcom is not Naughty Dog. Capcom is not Sony Santa Monica. Capcom is not Rockstar Games. Capcom isn't even Konami before Metal Gear became stupid. Even up until Metal Gear Peace Walker and parts of Metal Gear Ground Zeroes and parts of the Phantom Pain. Well, Phantom Pain for me is where it started to get a bit stupid. But up until recently, for the most part, Konami has done a brilliant job with Metal Gear Solid. And the Metal Gear Solid story arc, it's much more in depth and much more compelling than anything Capcom ever put out. Even with games like Devil May Cry. Oh, good lord, don't get me started on Devil May Cry. But getting to Resident Evil 2 Remake, character wise, Leon got a downgrade from the 1998 Leon. Okay, he is much more gullible and much more of a twerp. Sherry got a downgrade from the Resident Evil 2 Sherry, where she's acting even more indifferent to her whole world being torn apart in a matter of one day. Her home, her friends, her mom, and her dad all gone in a matter of one day, and she's acting even more indifferent to it. And Claire Redfield, the downgrade is so severe that I honestly think that this is Elza Walker in Resident Evil 2 Remake. This is not Claire Redfield. Elza Walker finally found the right directions to Raccoon City and showed up to take part in Resident Evil 2 Remake. You don't believe me? Just take a look at the original Resident Evil 2 and see how Claire ends the game.
It's over.
No. I have to find my brother.
You're right.
Chris, I have to find you.
She still did not forget that she has to look for Chris and she has to find Chris. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, what do we get?
So what's the first thing you want to do when we get out of here?
I want to see where you live.
Good. Zai, take a shower.
Yeah.
Really? That bad? Oh, yeah.
You insensitive. A small girl who had her entire world turned upside down and torn apart is sitting right there, and you have the audacity to cut this Bugs Bunny joke? In the original Resident Evil 2, Claire Redfield goes and hugs Sherry, which is much more appropriate to do to a little girl who had her home, her friends, her mom, and her dad all taken away in a matter of hours. At least go and hug her assuringly. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, what do we get?
So, are you guys like boyfriend and girlfriend?
No, we're just... Oh, we actually just met last night.
Yeah. That would have been one hell of a first date, though.
Good lord. So, an incident where thousands of people died. There's a girl that had everything taken from her is standing right next to you. All this disaster, and this is hell of a first date. This is a first date? Is this Claire Redfield or Harley Quinn? And also, no mention from this Claire Redfield of finding Chris, indicating that Capcom had no big plans with her. At least from the Resident Evil 2 ending of Claire Redfield, you had an idea that Capcom were going to put her in another game where Claire and Chris actually meet up and unite. But in this game, no mention of trying to find Chris in the ending cutscene, indicating that Capcom had no plans whatsoever. In fact, what they ended up doing is they ended up putting Claire Redfield in that stupid Resident Evil Infinite Stupidity. And maybe Claire's honeymoon will be when Raccoon City was nuked. If the disaster itself was a first date. And just for the record, I was about to buy Resident Evil 3 Remake because the original Resident Evil 3 was my favorite tank-controlled Resident Evil game of all time. because it took inspiration from The Terminator, which is one of my favorite movies, but the reviews kept me from buying Resident Evil 3 Remake. As Capcom did not answer this question, yet has shown pretty much obviously that whatever happened to Steve, she is still carrying the wounds of it 13 years down the line, as she is most likely suppressing the memory and did not get over what happened to Steve. If she is acting so hurt and traumatized whenever something triggers the memory of what happened to Steve. As Capcom did not answer this question, let me try and answer it based on what is presented in the games and what is not exclusive to Super Retcon material. Why? Why does what happened to Steve, a person she knew for only one day, still hurt her so badly that even after 13 years, she still has not managed to get over it and still suppresses the event of Code Veronica? Did Claire actually start to have romantic feelings for Steve?
Steve, what were you doing here? Who brought you here, and where is your family?
Never mind. Let's get going.
It's okay now. Just rest.
I know I caused a lot of trouble for you.
No, it's okay. It was hard for both of us.
Well, I really hope you find your brother. I know what it's like to be alone.
Oh, Steve.
It's all my fault.
Don't say that. Listen to me. We'll escape from here. Together. Steve! Don't forget. We'll get out of here. Together.
Ah! Ah!
No! Steve!
I'm sorry. I failed you.
Don't worry about it. Let's go.
Based on the events of Code Veronica alone, I will have to say I am not so sure. But based on the events of her following appearances in Biohazard incidents, it would seem maybe she did. The attraction that was there between Claire and Steve, if it existed, and all signs put together from all three relevant instances, suggests that if there was any type of attraction from Claire's side, it was an emotional attraction, not a physical attraction from Claire's side. Because it seems that Claire really cares about Steve's frame of mind. And if I were to pick a point or a time frame where Claire started to be attracted to Steve, albeit emotionally, it would not be at this point.
Ugh, it's finally over.
Because I have demonstrated earlier in this video that Claire basically smiles at everyone that she deems as a friend or sees favorably. So it's just part of her nature to smile at people that she does not dislike or has favorable opinions about. You see these type of people in real life all over the place. But it would have to be somewhere after that when Claire is consoling Steve.
Don't say that. Listen to me. We'll escape from here. Together.
And the point where Claire takes on Nosferatu. Because as Steve is dangling, taking a smoke break perhaps, Claire gives Nosferatu such a glare that she is going to kill him for hurting Steve. Also, when Chris finds Claire, Claire is the one that takes the lead for finding Steve, whereas Chris knows the layout a bit better because it resembles the Spencer Mansion and Chris was actually in Stars. So yeah, maybe Claire did start to like him back. Maybe Claire's shock at this moment where even the way she's retracting her hand is out of shock. And believe me, there is a lot of body language storytelling in this scene, but that is for someone else to analyze. It seems as if she didn't realize that Steve had such feelings for her. Or maybe I could be mistaken. But then again, I'm trying my best to answer the question Capcom did not answer ever since 2000. So it's been 22 years and Capcom still did not answer the question, why does what happened to Steve continue to haunt Claire? Now, remember earlier in the video, I mentioned that Claire is not romantically involved with anyone, but there is one exception. This is the possible exception that Claire was starting to have romantic feelings for Steve, at least by the end of Steve's life. But let's go back to this scene. The foreground story is
Claire!
Monster Steve was about to take Claire's head off, but stopped himself, called her name, and ended up saving her life, paying with his life in the process. The background story, and this is the whole purpose of this scene being as cheesy and as corny and as lame as it is. The only purpose of this scene was for Claire to see that she was about to get her head taken off by Monster Steve, but something in Monster Steve stopped him from taking her head off, calling her name, and saving her life, and because of which Monster Steve had to pay with his life in the process. The purpose of that scene was only for Claire to be made aware of that. This little detail in Darkside Chronicles is missing. And this is another example why I feel the Darkside Chronicles version of this event and many events is so much inferior. Also, moving on to this scene.
Your brother kept his promise. I'm sorry, I cannot.
As corny, cliche, cheesy, dumb, outright face-palming a moment as that is, the background story is that Claire is a person that really values keeping promises. And the fact that Steve made a promise to Claire that Claire just found out about, which Steve is unable to keep and apologizes for, elicited this reaction.
What are you saying?
This tells me that even Claire was surprised by Steve having these type of emotions and making these type of commitments to Claire that even she didn't know about. And obviously, the remaining love confession is basically answering a lot of those questions in Claire's mind. So, to answer that question, considering the traumatized reaction Claire keeps showing after this point, maybe she did love him. Maybe she didn't know that Steve had similar feelings, that too to this extent. It seems that maybe she did not know that Steve had such strong, similar feelings for her until the very end of his life. And maybe that is why she says that maybe she needs to learn to read people better in Revelations 2 or something along those lines. Beyond this, you will have to ask Capcom. But let's analyze that last moments of Steve's life scene a bit more.
Steve, you've got to hang in there, okay? My brother's come to save us. We're getting out of here. What are you saying?
That's the helium voice. That's a Japanese female voice actress technique used by a woman involving a situation with a man with some romantic involvement. You see this from Japanese voice actresses.
Oh, Steve.
See, there it is again. Good Lord. Alyson Court. Hats off to you, ma'am. Alyson Court pulled out all the techniques, it seemed like, in terms of voice acting for this game that would not contradict Claire Redfield's character. For a part of the game people laugh at. Poor Alyson Court. And this is why I say she is the best voice actress in this game, because yes, she is Canadian, but if you notice, she is the only one who is not doing an accent. Like Alfred Ashford, Alexia Ashford, they're doing accents. She is the only one who is not doing an accent, who does not sound Canadian. And wasn't she married to the voice director of this game, Eric Suzuki? Maybe that had something to do with the helium voice. I made an entire video about comparing the voice actors, Japan versus North America. Link in the description below. So, given that I have established the extent of the trauma, the extent of the misery caused by Steve's death that Claire Redfield is carrying for 13 years, suppressed but not resolved, what if someone were to find this specific type of anguish, this specific type of torment and misery to be very funny, because they find the suffering and torture of who they deem genetically inferior beings to be very funny. You have seen this clip before in my previous videos, but here it is again, and now I am going to explain in more detail how I would have actually written the Code Veronica trilogy. Not to great 100% detail, but basically more detail about my idea. Here is the clip again.
Claire.
Steve? Steve?
Steve?
For starters, Alfred Ashford needs to be alive or return in Code Veronica 2, at least at the end. Because remember, Alfred says this line in Code Veronica.
I won't forget about this, Claire.
Alfred is mad and livid with the Redfields, especially Claire, because the Redfields and Claire's involvement not only caused the death of his reawakened sister, but also ruined his world. So Alfred, in return, has become more sadistic and now will ruin Claire's world. So, in Code Veronica 2, have the plot that Sherry got kidnapped and Claire feels a personal responsibility to rescue her because Claire views her as a younger sister. And also, given that how poorly they used Sherry Birkin, basically turning her into one half of Wolverine in Resident Evil 6, I think this use of Sherry Birkin's character is much more appropriate. By the end of Code Veronica 2, in which you start telling a bit more of the backstory and what happened between Code Veronica and Code Veronica 2, including the part where Claire goes to therapy and is discussing with her therapist why this thing with Steve hurts her so much. At the end of Code Veronica 2, Claire finds a dying Sherry, takes Sherry in her arms. Sherry basically says that she always viewed Claire as her elder sister, and she thanks Claire for everything Claire has done for Sherry, and Sherry loves her elder sister. With that, she dies. A distraught Claire collapses to the floor, dissolving into tears. Then, all of a sudden, Claire begins to hear the Burkhorst lullaby, specifically the part about the arrow striking the naive king's heart who lost his life and his lady love. Then, on a screen in front of her, Alfred's picture appears in video. Alfred says, "First Steve, then Sherry. You can't seem to protect anyone in your life that you care about." And this is all done in the Mark Hamill style Joker laugh. If you can't get Mark Hamill, not a problem. Have Richard Cancino do it. He could have pulled it off. Have Troy Baker do it. He does a very good Joker. And then the transmission ends after Alfred says, "No more Redfields." This gives the message to Claire that Alfred is still alive, and Alfred is now going after Chris before going after Claire, because Alfred will burn Claire's world to the ground, just like Claire burned his world to the ground. At least that's how Alfred perceives it. The camera moves closer and closer to Claire's face, the scowl in her face getting more and more prominent. And the second game ends with Claire screaming Alfred's name from the top of her voice with a sudden cut to black. In the third game, after some modifications, maybe after 5 or 6 years, the events of Code Veronica, if you modify it just right, this can be an ending. This is Claire Redfield, this is Alfred Ashford, and this is Chris Redfield. Instead of her saying goodbye, my love, Claire says, "No, one way or another, this ends tonight. Goodbye, Chris." Claire is holding Alfred whilst the self-destruct sequence continues to count down. The nicest human being in all of Resident Evil that you can find in terms of protagonists has been driven to the point to being obsessed with vengeance, to the point where she will even kill herself in front of Chris if that will guarantee the end of Alfred Ashford and the last remaining Ashford. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, they could have told a Mask of the Phantasm style story. Claire Redfield could have become the Phantasm, the Joker Alfred, and Batman in this case is Chris Redfield. The death of Claire Redfield in this way would further fuel the rage of Chris towards anything biohazard or umbrella related. And if you had to put that the Redfields are orphans, you could have put it at this point. Chris saying that after mom and dad, you were all I had, and now you are gone. And this is why, for the past few months, I have been going on and on and on in videos, in comments, you name it, about Code Veronica and the tragedy of Claire Redfield. Because the more I discovered about the gravity of the tragedy of Claire Redfield, the more I realized that Resident Evil Code Veronica could have been turned into a trilogy that told the greatest Resident Evil story ever told. But Capcom blew it. And this is because tragedy usually forms the basis of some very, very powerful storytelling. Without the tragedy, the story of Batman wouldn't be as good. The story of Spider-Man, the good ones wouldn't be as good. The story of Metal Gear Solid, the story of God of War, the story of the first Last of Us, the story of Red Dead Redemption, none of them would be as good without the tragedy. The first Code Veronica established the tragedy. Capcom failed to capitalize and build upon it, and thus Capcom failed to tell the greatest Resident Evil story that could ever be told. And it's not like Capcom had any restrictions on being dark. I mean, in 2001, we got Twisted Metal Black, perhaps one of the darkest games ever made, where you have people like Needles Kane, you have people like Bloody Mary, you have people like Mr. Grimm, you have people like Manslaughter. So I believe Capcom were completely able to tell that story, but they blew it. Instead, what they turned Resident Evil into now is a poor man's version of X-Men. Sherry gets half of Wolverine's powers, Lady Dimitrescu gets the other half of Wolverine's powers, Rose Winters gets some powers like Jean Grey, you have a villain that can control metal like Magneto, you have run out of viruses, so you come up with the mold that allows you to do whatever the plot wants you to do. Good Lord, where does the stupidity end? And finally, to conclude, this is what happened to Claire Redfield that most of the people missed. An enormous-hearted, kind girl got taken to her emotional and psychological breaking point. And she never recovered from the trauma. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for staying with me for this journey and for this long video. Now, I have not forgotten about my other project. Here is a preview for my upcoming project, as also a way of saying thank you for sticking with me this long. Make sure to hit like, subscribe, and the bell notification buttons, as all your support will really help me remain motivated to continue making various type of content on this channel, and would really help out a legally blind YouTube content creator. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't worry about long comments. Don't worry about too many comments. I respond to pretty much every comment. I'll see you in the next video.
Instead of setting it free, I took what I hated and made it a part of me. And now you become a part of me. You'll always be right here. You become a part of me. You'll always be my fear. I can't separate myself from what I've done. Giving up a part of me. I've let myself become you. The memories come back again. I remember when it started happening. I'd see you in every thought I had, and then the thoughts only found words attached to them. And I knew as they escaped away, I was committing myself to them. And every day